Good evening, this is your host, Mr. Dark, bringing you a series of some of the most terrifying, strange, and true short horror stories of crimes, murders, abductions, and experiences. You're listening to the Dark Side Diaries podcast. Hell's Canyon Massacre. On the Oregon-Idaho border, along a desolate and remote part of the Snake River, lies what is known as Chinese Massacre Cove, a name given to it from an event back in May 1887. It's a dusty riverbank that's located in the middle of Hell's Canyon. Many Chinese immigrants who came to the United States during the 19th century would make their way to the American West. They faced considerable discrimination along with challenging working conditions as most became laborers and miners. They'd often find themselves working land that other miners wouldn't want to. The Chinese miners that mined the land around the cove were likely working in those same conditions. While Chinese immigrants were instrumental in building the West, they faced unprecedented violence such as being lynched or shot. The Cove is home to one of the most brutal massacres of Chinese people in the United States ever documented. Known as the Hell's Canyon Massacre, the murders were covered up for over a century. In October 1886, Che Po and Li Shi were leading two groups of Chinese gold miners from Lewiston, Idaho along the Snake River to Hell's Canyon, Oregon. Along their journey, they split into two groups. Li's group would continue upriver to Salt Creek, while Chi picked a spot just upstream of Doug Bar, a ford used by horse and cattle thieves to cross the Snake River. Approximately a half-mile from Chi's camp was an abandoned cabin which was being used by a group of horse gang thieves. The gang consisted of Bruce Evans, J.T. Canfield, C.O. LaRue, Frank Vaughn, Carl Hughes, Harriam Maynard, and 15-year-old Robert McMillan. Finding Chi's camp, the gang robbed, murdered, and mutilated the group of Chinese miners. After the onslaught, the killers wrecked and burned the camp while throwing the mutilated corpses into the Snake River. With spring runoff being in the high water phase, the dead bodies wouldn't be found for weeks along the river. Robert McMillan, a few years later, in a confession on his deathbed, would recount details of the massacre to his father, Hugh McMillan. Hugh, Robert's father, stated in late April 1887, the Chinese miners were ambushed by Bruce Evans, J.T. Canfield, Max LaRue, Frank Vaughn, and his son Robert. Harriam Maynard and Carl Hughes were traveling with them, but did not participate in the massacre. Canfield and LaRue were the first to attack the camp of 13 Chinese miners. They came from the bluffs overlooking the cove and drove the miners towards Evans and Vaughn, who were able to prevent them from getting away. 12 men were killed first, with the 13th and last man having his brains beaten out, according to Robert, retrieving $5,500 in gold dust. The following day, 8 more Chinese miners returned to the camp by boat, where the gang shot and killed them. The gang threw all 21 of the bodies into the Snake River. Stealing the boat and traveling to the next Chinese camp, the gang went 4 miles, where they killed 13 more Chinese miners and retrieved $50,000 in gold. Their surprise attack was successful. All of the miners at the camp were killed. With the gang out of ammunition, they killed the last victim with a rock. 34 lives were taken over 2 days in the massacre. Hughes stated that Robert was only present for the first day of the massacre, but the gang had discussed the following day's plans before he left the group. The bodies of some murder victims began washing ashore downstream soon afterward. Each body showed marks of horrific violence. A news article from July 1887 called the corpses a severe warning to Chinese miners, where they blamed the victims. In 1888, Frank Vaughn would confess to the crime. His testimony led a grand jury to indict the other gang members. 3 of the accused disappeared and were never apprehended. The remaining members were acquitted. Idaho Judge Joseph K. Vincent, who was hired to investigate the murders, said, "It was the most cold-blooded, cowardly treachery I have ever heard tell on this coast. Everyone was shot, cut up, and stripped, and thrown in the river." Among the layered tragedies of the massacre was the loss of identities of the men who died. Only 11 out of 34 victims' names were left behind. A granite memorial at Chinese Massacre Cove says, "Site of the 1887 massacre of as many as 34 Chinese gold miners. No one was held accountable." Wichita Horror. It would start on December 7th, 2000 in Wichita, Kansas, where 22-year-old Reginald Carr and his 20-year-old brother Jonathan Carr would carjack 23-year-old Andrew Schreiber at gunpoint. The Carr brothers, already having criminal records, made Schreiber drive to various ATM machines and withdraw all his money. The two brothers would split up, one staying with Schreiber and the other followed in another car. They eventually made it to a field northeast of town, where they pistol-whipped Schreiber, shot out his tires on his car, and fled in the other vehicle. Fortunately, Schreiber got out alive, but the Carr brothers' next victims wouldn't be so lucky. Police didn't have much to go on, except a description of two black males. 4 days would pass, and on December 11th, 2000, 55-year-old Ann Walletta would be the next victim. One of the brothers approached her car parked in her driveway and asked her for help. Cautiously, she rolled her window down a little to hear what he was saying. Aggressively, he stuck a gun sideways into the small opening of the window and shot her several times as she tried to drive away. She would survive long enough to describe to the police the suspects and how they approached her car. She would later become paralyzed from the waist down and died days later in the hospital from her injuries. With police no closer to finding the suspects, they knew there was potential of things getting much worse, and they did. On December 15, 2000, the true violent nature of the Carr brothers came to a group of innocent victims once again. A couple was awoken by a woman pounding loudly on their front door. With sub-zero winter temperatures and harsh wind, the woman was completely naked, freezing, and bleeding from her head. She walked through the snow for almost a mile, following only the glow of a cross lit in the Christmas lights of the home. The couple who opened their door heard, "I need to tell you my story before I die." As she sobbed, she told the couple and police her disturbing account. The night of December 14th, the 25-year-old elementary school teacher Holly G arrived at her boyfriend Jason Belfort's home. Belfort had two roommates, Brad Hickey and Aaron Sander. Heather Mueller was also at the home as she was a friend of Sanders. The group of friends, after watching TV, decided to go to bed for the night. What would follow would be a living nightmare. Holly was awoken by loud voices in the hallway, followed by the Carr brothers kicking in Belfort's bedroom door, which was where she was sleeping. The Carrs had broken into the home. At gunpoint, one Carr brother held Holly, Belfort, and Sanders captive, while the other brother found Hickey and Mueller and brought them upstairs with the others. The brothers ordered the 5 victims to take their clothes off and then bound them. Scouring the home for valuables, the Carr brothers came across a popcorn tin with an engagement ring in it. Belfort told Holly he was planning to propose to her Christmas Eve. With the victims naked and bound, the captors proceeded to beat the 3 men with golf clubs and forced them to watch as the Carrs sexually assaulted the women. They subjected the women to various forms of sexual humiliation, including rape, oral sex, and forcing the women to engage in sexual acts with each other, as well as the 3 men. For more than an hour, the rape and abuse would go on, until the victims were rounded up and forced into one of the victims' trucks. The nude men were put in the trunk of the vehicle, while the women were thrown in the back seat. The Carr brothers, wanting more, drove the victims to ATMs to empty their bank accounts, where they withdrew almost $2,000 from the victims altogether. After draining the accounts, they drove them to a deserted soccer complex on the outskirts of town. The Carr brothers ordered the victims out of the car. instructing them to kneel down in a row, and one by one, the Carr brothers shot each of their captives in the back of the head, execution style. Then they ran them over with the truck they drove. Holly miraculously survived due to her plastic hair barrette. It had deflected the bullet meant for her brain, and the weight of the truck had somehow not crushed her. When she heard the Carr brothers drive off, she called out to her friends, only hearing a faint moan from her boyfriend Belfort, who she tried to save. Freezing and alone, she began her snowy trek, bleeding, naked, and traumatized, to the faint light she could see in the distance of the couple's house. The Carr brothers, after leaving the soccer complex, returned to Belfort's home to steal more valuables, where in the process they used golf clubs to beat Holly's pet dog, Nikki, to death. With Holly's amazing survival and her detailed description of the perpetrators, a news broadcast went out immediately, and a day later, neighbors at a nearby apartment building reported the Carr brothers. Once detained, Schreiber and the dying Wilnetta were also able to confirm the suspects in their crimes. The Carr brothers were tried for 113 crimes, including capital murder, kidnapping, rape, and robbery. They were convicted on almost every count. They were sentenced to death, but their sentence has been up in the air for decades, with multiple appeals at the state and U.S. Supreme Court levels. Former FBI Special Agent Michael Tabman said, "You want to ask and answer the question why? What was their motives? And we can't answer that. We can't find the motivation other than evil." This concludes our episode of the Dark Side Diaries. Please remember to follow, like, share, and subscribe for future episodes.